Hello, my name is Shirgi, and in this video, I'll be talking about how I orchestrated the third movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. In this video, I'll be guiding you through my thought process of translating piano solo to orchestra, and of course, some general orchestration tips along the way. First, of course, in order to orchestrate something, we need to listen to the original. So let's listen to the original Moonlight Sonata, provided here by Classic Mountain MuseScore. This is, of course, just MIDI playback, but I'm sure if you're watching this video, you've heard Moonlight Sonata 1,000 times, so this is just to get an idea of the music and its score. Before we even get to orchestrating, we need to think about what we want to achieve with our orchestration. It's very important that you have a set feeling in mind. There's a big difference between just putting the music onto the orchestra and deliberately writing the orchestra around the music. When you're writing for orchestra, you got to think about which instruments best bring out the feeling that you want to evoke. In this piece, of course, I want to evoke feelings of distress, urgency, anger, tension, stuff like that. This will greatly influence our decisions about which instruments to put what melodies on. Now, before we get started, I gotta point out this difference between Beethoven's score and mine. The original Moonlight Sonata is, of course, in C-sharp minor, but I have put my score in D minor. How can I transpose Beethoven and get away with it? I can't believe I would do such a thing, me. Let us remember that the instruments of the orchestra aren't pianos, okay? Playing arpeggios on a piano is different than playing arpeggios on a bassoon, is different than playing arpeggios on a violin. They are literally built different. You can't just take one and put it on the other. Of course, some virtuoso instrumentalists will be able to pull off pianistic, quote-unquote, runs and stuff on their instruments. So what does that have to do with the key that I wrote my arrangement in? If you're not aware, some instruments transpose, which means that the notes that the players read is different than the notes that are heard. You don't really need to know what that means, and this is not going to be an in-depth explanation as to why instruments transpose. But basically what that means is if I disable this button concert pitch here, you can see the score as it would be read by real instrumentalists. And you'll notice that the key signatures are different between instruments. The D minor is preserved in instruments that aren't transposing, like strings and also oboes and flutes. But the instruments that do transpose, like clarinet and trumpet, do transpose, so their key signatures are different. Remember that when you're not writing in concert pitch, this is the score that the players would be reading. So let me go over here to the left and just apply C-sharp minor to the score here and see what the players would be reading. And oh my goodness, the trumpet would be reading 6 sharps. The horn is reading, 5? And clarinet is also reading 6. That is a lot of sharps. Now, unless you have a top-of-the-line orchestra, which if you're watching this video, I can probably safely assume that you're not, because otherwise you wouldn't be watching this video. I don't think you have to be a very advanced composer to know that you don't want to read this and the instrumentalists don't want to read this. So in order to fix this problem, I've just raised the entire piece up by 1 semitone. So moving from C-sharp minor, here C-sharp to D minor, that's just 1/2 step away. Poof! A bunch of those sharps go away. In fact, the horns don't even have any accidentals. The trumpets only have 1 sharp, which is much better than 6, and so do the clarinets also have 1 sharp. This will be much easier to read and much easier to play, and not to mention the instruments will probably sound much more resonant in this key. That's not something I'm really going to dive into, but the keys that have less accidentals, the instruments will generally sound a bit more resonant on, just because of the way they're constructed. Most symphonies and stuff are written in these keys that don't have so many accidentals. Instruments are generally built around those kinds of key signatures, so they sound better in those keys. You could also transpose the piece down to C minor, which is also a 1/2 step away from C sharp. The trumpets and the horns don't play too many accidentals. The rest of the orchestra would be playing 3 flats, which is fine, I guess. I just chose D minor because D minor is simpler. So now let's talk about which instruments we're going to put these notes on. Let's start with these beautiful arpeggios happening in the right hand of the piano. These arpeggios are very iconic, and I want them to be very well heard, just so this piece screams Moonlight Sonata. Other orchestrated versions I've heard online usually play these arpeggios in the strings. Either they have the strings actually play all of these notes, or they kind of approximate all of these notes by just having the strings tremolo over the chords that these arpeggios create. I would argue that those arpeggios really don't belong on the strings. I've pulled up an example here to demonstrate. Notice the BPM is at 175, which is a very presto speed. Let's listen to the arpeggios in the piano first. Beautiful. Now let's listen to those same arpeggios, but in the strings. So that was a little funkier. The notes weren't pronounced very well, and some of them even sounded like they overlapped each other at some points. Now, of course, you could argue that this is because this is MIDI playback, this is computer playback. It's not going to be perfect because it's just the sampler. But just think about your poor players playing this in an actual orchestral setting. Even if your players could play these notes, I hesitate to think that as the audience member, you would be able to hear all of these notes as precisely as you would on a piano. Let us remember that the string section is made up of dozens of players per group, so having dozens of people try and play all of these notes at a presto speed, all at the same time at the exact same rhythm, I think is just really impractical. It probably could be done, but I just think there's a much better way of orchestrating these arpeggios that's not only easier on the players, but also just sounds more clear. Let me reiterate that I think that these arpeggios are very iconic to having Moonlight Sonata Movement 3 in general. So I want to be able to hear each individual note. To help with hearing each individual note, I've actually slowed down the tempo from presto just a little bit. On versions you'll hear on piano, or if you play the piece yourself, you're probably playing it at a tempo of around maybe like 160 to like 180 or 190 if you're really pushing it. Of course, Beethoven marked that himself. He marked presto agitato. This might be a little bit difficult for me to articulate, but I would rather be able to hear every note enunciated and pronounced correctly by the orchestra than to have it be played fast, even if it's more faithful to the original material, and have all the notes kind of overlap each other, overall make a general muddy orchestral mess. So I've cooled down the tempo here to 150 BPM. If we go back to our example of the strings overlapping and I mute the tempo down to 150, the strings, of course, do sound a little bit more tame and don't overlap each other just as much. That sounds fine, I suppose, but again, I still think that we can do better than this. So what instruments do we put them in, if not the strings? This arpeggio phrase goes from piano to subito forte. The way that MIDI plays back this piece is very literal, so it has a piano dynamic, piano, 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 subito forte. But as I interpret the piece, the dynamic should go piano, piano, build up, build up, build up, build up, and then subito forte. So there is a little build up from this piano, but the subito forte is of course still very sudden. You can think of this S just meaning sudden if you don't know subito means sudden. So keep that in mind as we're arranging. I want to make this line go from piano, crescendo, and then subito forte. But then which instruments do we even put that on? There are so many to choose from. Let me remind you that one of my conditions was that I want this melody line to be very articulated and very enunciated. So I want to choose instruments that are very good at enunciating arpeggios, especially at this quick tempo. Instruments that are good at doing this are, I would say, the entire woodwind section and also trumpets from the brass section. Tuba is good, but it's just a little too low for what we want. Trombones, I bet you could just imagine the trombones trying to play those arpeggios, and it ain't pretty. They're going to end up with some kind of arthritis. Horns are actually quite good at playing fast runs. However, I think the horn just has a tone quality that isn't really suited to having these fast presto arpeggios. Let me remind you, this is at presto. Let's listen to these lower notes in comparison to the piano. These lower notes here are not very articulated. You can hear how they kind of just mesh together. Plus this note here, again, possible on horn at presto agitato. Good luck trying to hear that note. As it gets higher in the horn's range where it's more comfortable, it will sound more enunciated and better. But I think, of course, we can do better than that. So that leaves us with the woodwind section. And the woodwinds that can play these low notes are the clarinets and the bassoons. Now the clarinet cannot, of course, play this low note. A bass clarinet can, which you can choose to use the bass clarinet if you'd like. I just chose to use the bassoons because I didn't feel like adding in a bass clarinet, so it's bassoon it is. And now bassoons are playing these lower notes. I'll talk about why these notes are separated in a moment. Remember that I wanted this arpeggio to build up, build up, build up, and then subito forte. How do I convey a build up through the orchestra? One thing you could do is to make these instruments go from softer to louder. So here I've included the clarinet because the bassoon, of course, cannot play these notes. That sounds fine. That sounds great, actually. You can hear every individual note, and you can clearly tell that it gets from a little bit softer to louder. This would be good if this wasn't Moonlight Sonata we're talking about. I need more drama. This has got to be even more urgent. Clarinets, I'm sorry, clarinets, you just don't scream urgency to me. Now, which of these instruments screams urgency to me, but also can play these notes very articulately like I wish? Oh, you, trumpet in B flat. So that's exactly what I've done. I've moved here from bassoons to trumpets, because trumpets, well, I don't need to tell you twice that trumpets are very loud and they're very dramatic, and I love them very much for this. So let's listen to the bassoon and trumpet work together for these arpeggios to create a very dramatic buildup. Now, why did I split up the arpeggio line between two instruments? The reason I've done this is because, let us remind ourselves, not every instrument in the orchestra is a piano. They can't just dance their hands around in their cookie-cutter fashions to play these arpeggios. It's a little different than that. Plus, wind's gotta have a breath somewhere, because they use their mouth to make the wind. Because these arpeggios are being played quite fast, I've decided to give the players just a little bit of a break in between to both catch their breath and also maybe adjust their hands. You could put these arpeggios in one single instrument. This is, of course, possible, but just as a general pointer, just make your orchestrations as easy to play as possible. Don't strain your players any more than you need to without sacrificing the kind of sound that you want. In this case, doing this is not sacrificing any of the sound, it just sounds like one continuous bassoon. Now, what about the accompaniments? How do we convey with the accompaniments to this melody that we want urgency and anger? For that, I've just done something very, very simple, actually. I took this from Somewhere by Vivaldi, who's my favorite composer. I say I take that from somewhere. This is just a very Vivaldi kind of string arrangements. If you listen to Vivaldi regularly, you'll know this. In Beethoven's original, he just kind of had some alternating bass notes, so nothing super involved, just this octave here at this big crash. So I put those alternating notes in the cello, had some repeated notes happening in all the other strings, and it sounds like this. Also notice that I've put these hairpins in here indicating a crescendo, meaning we're going from quiet to loud, just like we discussed earlier. For comparison's sake, now I've removed all the hairpins, and let's listen to what it sounds like with the sudden forte instead of the gradual forte. I just think it's more interesting from just a listener standpoint to have it build up instead of it be so sudden. I think having it build up really sells that feeling of urgency that I want. Having a sudden crash is good for some pieces, not really the feeling that we want to go for here. I'm not trying to necessarily scare the audience. That's a different ball game. Here we want to tell the audience that there is something very rushed and hurried and urgent happening. So the crescendos really sell that. Similarly, in the percussion, I have this bass drum here, just doing the roll that goes from piano to forte. And then, of course, for that big subito forte moment, in order to really sell that big, loud, sudden hit, I've included a cymbal. So let's play the bass drum, cymbal, and the strings together. Now, what's the rest of the orchestra to do? You'll notice that I've saved all of the other instruments until that big, loud subito forte moment. So even though we have this crescendo going on in the accompaniments, in order to both have that crescendo but also have the subito forte, because we could just have a normal piano to forte here. Piano, build up, build up, build up, and then big forte, not just piano, build up, build up, build up, forte. There's a difference, I think, and I hope I'm conveying that difference to you. So in order to really sell it to Beethoven Forte, I've saved all of the other instruments until that big, huge crash. And what notes are they playing? They're just playing the rest of the chord that's here. So this is in Beethoven's original, this is a normal C sharp minor chord. Of course, in mine, it's D minor. But anyway, my point is I just kind of dotted these notes around according to their instrument ranges. The horns have a nice, good, powerful middle range. The trombones have pretty much good range in anything that they can play, so I've just put them in octaves here. Oboes and flutes are soprano instruments. Clarinet is also a soprano instrument. It can be a tenor instrument, but in this case, I've just made it a soprano instrument. And you'll notice here, what intonation is this? Beethoven would never, ever, ever write anything like this. This is just a me thing that I included. Of course, if you listen to classical music, you'll know that I took this run from Stravinsky. These piccolo runs really emphasize an orchestral crash in a way that I guess it's difficult to explain. I'll just need to have you listen to it. But I hope you'll agree that this piccolo really adds a lot. So altogether, the arpeggiated bassoons move into the louder arpeggiated trumpets. The drive and accompaniment happening in the strings. The roll of the bass drum move into a cymbal. And then the crash of the instruments happening with the piccolo. Let's hear what that sounds like all together. I'll play for you the first 4 bars. Now, where do we go from here? We could just have the same instrumentation for the rest of the phrase, but of course, that's boring, isn't it? In the original Moonlight Sonata, it just goes piano and then forte, and then piano again, then forte, and then piano again, then forte, and then yada, yada, yada. And there is a crescendo here. Me personally, as an orchestrator and also, a musician, I think it's much, much more interesting. Throughout the phrase, this piano gets slightly louder. So there are crescendos happening here, and there's like one broad crescendo happening here. So how do I have these mini crescendos and then also the one big crescendo? We already have a huge crescendo happening here. Well, let us not forget that there are still more instruments to be used here. Look at how all of these instruments are just silent for these bars here. And the next little iteration, I added more instruments on top of this. So instead of just having bassoons trade off this melody, effectively creating one heard bassoon, I would say. Like you can hear one bassoon, but it's 2 bassoons playing this, but it just sounds like one bassoon, right? But here I've put 2 bassoons playing this, and then I put some clarinets on top. So they're still doing this alternating thing, but in order to strengthen the power of these bassoons, I've doubled them, and so too the clarinets. So this should sound just ever so slightly louder. So let me play you this phrase first. And now let me play you this. I hope you could hear that this just feels just a tiny bit louder than you. Although there is a crescendo happening here, there is also a broader crescendo happening across the orchestra. I still left the trumpets here playing, I guess what you would call one heard trumpet. It just sounds like one trumpet, even though it's split between 2. The trumpet is loud enough. We established this. The trumpet is just super loud. It's okay. If you ask the trumpet to play louder, by golly, it will. At some point, though, if you ask the bassoons to play louder, they'll kind of stare at you and with their red-hot tomato face and say, "What are you doing to me? My face hurts." So we continue that pattern here. We have the 2 bassoons, 2 clarinets, and also here I've included 2 bassoons, 2 oboes, and clarinets. Even here I added just a little bit of horns to reinforce these bassoon notes because, of course, like I said, the bassoon can only really get so loud, especially when the entire rest of the orchestra is building up on top of it. Even though I said that horns aren't very good at articulating these notes, they're just supporting these bassoons. So the bassoons are really the ones that are going to be heard. The horns are just there to like artificially boost their volume, you know? So let's recap the buildup of the instruments. First, we have 2 bassoons that sound like one bassoon. Next, we have 2 bassoons in unison, and then 2 clarinets in unison. Next, we have 2 bassoons in unison, 2 oboes in unison, and 2 clarinets in unison, so getting more people into the party. And then here we have bassoons and horns, and then we have oboes and clarinets playing together. I'll also point out here that I also put the trumpet on top of some of these notes as well, just to make them just even louder, you know? The crescendos of the accompaniment also got just slightly louder. I moved them from forte to fortissimo, but otherwise the instrumentation here is just the same. So let's listen to this entire phrase. Now Now let's move on to the next part, which is just this part here. I didn't exactly follow the forte direction that Beethoven put down. Because we just had this big buildup of instruments, I thought, and plus we're just getting started in this piece, all right? These are just the first few bars. There's no need to peak too early here. So what I've done here is, in order to create a big contrast, I've moved from this big forte buildup and then suddenly like a piano interlude. The ones playing the melody, of course, are playing forte because they're the ones playing the melodies. But the rest of the orchestra is playing at piano instead of at forte, like you might expect. I'm not really big on being like a musical purist. I'm not big on orchestrating this like Beethoven might have, or following Beethoven's score exactly. I just really want to sell the feeling that this piece gives me. You can do whatever you choose to do. If you want to have like a big forte passage here for this, then go ahead and be my guest. This is just how I chose to do it. These drone notes here that Beethoven put in, I just put in the woodwinds, and this melody I've decided to just put in strings, and then they move to trumpets. Now why did I put that melody in the strings, and what the heck is the collegno doing here? Collegno is when string players play their strings not using the hair on their bows, but using the back of their bows with the wood. It creates this percussive effect on their strings. Why did I decide to put these instruments in collegno? Because this piece is supposed to sound kind of like urgency, right? And like you're on a deadline is how I imagine it. I wanted something that kind of imitates the sound of a ticking clock, you know? So that's why I put these instruments in collegno, because I thought that the percussiveness of striking the strings with the back of the bow would kind of imitate the sound of a ticking clock, and I really like that. I have the violins here playing the melody. They're playing spiccato, which means they're playing these notes very short, and they're just kind of like bouncing their bow on the tip of their strings. It's also percussive like collegno is, but you get the notes heard much better than the collegno notes. Just for comparison, let's listen to the notes in collegno. Like you can definitely hear some notes happening, but you can hear the percussion even more. But when you play spiccato, it's much easier to hear the notes, but you still get that little bit of percussive feel. Just to keep things interesting, I traded off the melody from the violins to the trumpets. I could have very easily just had it be played on the violins the whole way around. I like to keep it fresh and interesting, so I traded it off to the trumpets. I could have traded it off to oboes or clarinets or something. I just chose trumpets. Take your pick. Try it in all of them. We have the technology, okay? Just try it in all of them. You don't need to imagine it no more. Altogether, the percussiveness of the collegno strings, and then also the percussiveness of the spiccato violins, along with the drone notes and the woodwinds, and also some melody line happening in the trumpets as well. It sounds like this. Ooh, I forgot to mention this big tutti chord. How exactly did I write such a big dramatic sounding chord? First, let's listen to it one more time. Notice there I didn't include a lot of harmony. They all sound like they're playing the same note. A, 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 E, 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 E. You're not really going to hear the harmony in a perfect fifth that much. It's just there to really reinforce the A notes. Think of like a power chord on like a guitar, you know? The fifth is there just to really make the root note feel stronger. And the reason I didn't write such a big chord here is, first of all, I'm pretty sure in Beethoven's original, he didn't even have like a big chord. He just had the single note happening. You can see in Beethoven's original, it's just one note. I went for something similar here by having this wonderful power chord. You could also just have all of the instruments play the same note. That's fine. I just chose the power chord because, well, power chords are cool, and they do, as they say, they give your piece more power. Now, where do we go from here? The next few parts in the Moonlight Sonata are mostly pretty similar. They're just harmonically different. Not until it gets to this phrase here, right? But otherwise, these few bars here are pretty much the same as what was happening over here, like in terms of technique. You could just take kind of the same technique that you did over here and put it over here, but I don't like that. keep it nice and fresh. That way your listeners don't get bored, and neither do you get bored of orchestrating it. I guess you could do it the lazy way if you really wanted to, or maybe if someone commissioned you to write an orchestral transcription of this, but I don't have that kind of constraint, so I can spend as much as I want on this. Of course, I did still want to keep that same general kind of feeling from before. I just want it to be slightly different so that, it's different. And it's not just the same kind of orchestration every time we encounter these arpeggios. First, let's think about how I wanted this next part to sound in comparison with the first part. Not even thinking of any instruments or anything, just how I wanted to sound. We had this very, very dramatic beginning, and I wanted it to start off with a crash because it's just fun to start off with a crash, ain't it? Afterwards, I wanted it to mellow out just a tiny bit. By starting off a little bit smaller, we can then just keep adding and adding to that to get even more dramatic. For this, you'll notice that the arpeggios are of course still in the woodwinds because the woodwinds, again, are very good at enunciating these arpeggios, but you'll see a lack of trumpets here because I didn't want the crescendos to be as dramatic as in the first part. To also really mellow out the tone, instead of having a bass drum roll, I've just included a triangle roll. And in the strings, the cellos and the contrabasses are playing mostly the same thing. The violas and the violins are playing something different. They're just playing tremolos instead of the repetitive notes that they had before. So let's compare. So as you can hear there, the repeated drive-in notes in the beginning, I feel are a little more dramatic, whereas the tremolos are a little bit more mellowed out. They're a little smoother. I've included still the piccolo run here. That's how I orchestrated this part until we get to the next phrase. So let's listen. Let me reiterate for the 100th time that this piece has got to create a sense of urgency. Something bad's gonna happen and your orchestra needs to say it. So how do we go about making that kind of dramatic feeling? Well, a crescendo, of course, big crescendo. I really just chose oboes here playing this melody because, well, the oboes haven't really gotten the melody yet. Like, it's the clarinets and bassoons here, and then the bassoons and trumpets here, and oboes only get like a tiny bit here. The melody here is being played by mostly the oboes. Also, the clarinet's lower, but you're going to hear the oboes because they're higher. Oboes can really only play so loud, especially when you're pitting them against the brass instrumentation that I have here, which is, of course, very simple. You can see it's just chords. And the strings here are playing their tremolos and their drive-in notes. Even an oboe at its loudest will kind of struggle to be heard over all of that stuff happening in the rest of the orchestra. So the oboe needs a little help from its friends. In particular, in this latter half of this build-up here, I've included the trumpets playing exactly what the oboes playing. The trumpets have a similar tone quality to the oboes. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous maybe if you're hearing that for the first time, but trust me on this one. They really do have similar tone qualities, don't you think? Of course, they're not like the same and one can't just be traded for the other, right? But we want to build up here, and in this case, you can kind of think of the trumpet as a continuation of the oboe, but louder and more brash, right? Also, I've included flutes here. Flutes just playing an octave up. This is something that can very easily be done for any instrument, even if this melody was in the trumpets, even if this melody was in the horns, this melody was in trombones, violins, whatever. Having an instrument play an octave above will just make it sound louder. In this case, I just chose flutes because, well, what other instrument is going to help here? I mean, I guess you could choose violins, but flutes are also woodwinds, so they'll blend a little bit together with the oboes in comparison to the violins, which are of a completely different instrument group, so they won't blend as well as two woodwinds together, as you might imagine. More and more dramatic dynamic changes, just a lot of dramatic dynamics. Look at here. Piano to fortissimo, piano to fortissimo. Let me tell you, dynamics make a huge difference in making your piece sound much more alive. So please, pretty please, use them as much as you like. As we build up to this last part of the phrase, I want it to be even louder. So what I've done is I've just put strings playing along with the woodwinds here. If I had the brass also playing the melody, I thought it might be just a little bit too loud for what I want. Let's listen to this phrase together. In other orchestrated versions I heard of this Moonlight Sonata, these runs here were put in the strings, which I just don't understand. Just listen to these runs, they just sound like flute runs. Come on, okay? I mean, maybe that's a violin. That's a fruit. That's a fruit. That's a fruit run. That's a flute run if I've ever heard one, all right? So I've put these wonderful melody lines in the flutes. For accompanying these flutes, I put the chords in the brass here, quiet brass, trumpet, and trombone. I chose a brass harmony under the flute melodies because they're of two different instrument groups. It's kind of like a general-ish orchestration principle that if you have your melody in one orchestra group, you should have your accompaniment in another orchestra group. That's 100% not a hard and fast rule. It's just kind of like something you can do if you want to create a little bit of contrast, so I just did that. This could very easily be played in strings or very easily just be played in other woodwinds because, well, these flutes are different enough from the rest of the instruments to be heard over everyone else anyway. So again, just take your pick. Because I had this like quieter interlude with only piccolo and flute playing and then like some soft brassy chords playing. I also have another dramatic hit here. These big hits here I've accentuated very much with fortissimo and accents. These chords are different than the big power chord that we saw before in that these chords actually have harmony in them instead of just the root and the fifth and maybe the octave, right? How am I writing such a powerful chord for the whole orchestra? Let's start from the bottom here with the strings. The strings here are all playing the same note. Why would I write all the strings having the same note? Wouldn't it be more powerful if I had the strings playing different notes? This is again kind of like a general guideline rule, nothing hard and fast, but it's my recommendation when you're writing a big chord for a full orchestra. Your strings shouldn't be very busy. There shouldn't be too many chords happening in between. In fact, I think there's a B flat in 5 different octaves. It's B flat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So yes, B flats in every octave. The reason that I recommend writing strings like this, if you're writing for the rest of the orchestra on top of it, is because strings have a very dense and heavy sound. And this very rich and textured sound is great if the strings are mostly playing on their own. If the strings are supposed to be combining with the rest of the orchestra, having lots of strings playing lots of different notes, and then on top of that having a bunch of other instruments play notes on top of that already super dense sound of the string section, it just doesn't work very well in my opinion. The notes aren't very clear. You could do much better than that. This way, the thick texture of the strings lays the foundation upon which all of the other instruments will build off. Now for everyone else, make sure that you put these instruments in the ranges where they sound the loudest because we want a loud orchestra. I didn't really do that for trumpet here. The trumpets aren't super loud here, but well, they're trumpets, so even though they're not their loudest here, you're going to hear them anyway. I haven't written this trombone all the way up here because this trombone up here, I think has a very sweet and very grand tone that I don't want right now. I want a very evil tone. I want a very urgent and angry tone. Same with the horns here. The horn has a very sweet range up here in the treble-ish range, but that's not what I want. I want a darker sound, so I put the horns in their darker sounding range. The bassoons here are playing this wonderful B flat, which I believe is their lowest note actually. Yeah, they can't get any lower than this B flat one, so I kind of looked out there with having them play that low note. The bassoons here are very awesome. Listen to that low note. Isn't that wonderful? Now here I've decided to put the clarinets above the oboes, which is a decision that is not like unusual. If you read orchestration textbooks, they'll tell you that if you're writing for woodwinds especially, to follow what they call the natural order of the register. You wouldn't have a bass singer sing an alto song and you wouldn't have a soprano singer sing a tenor song. It just doesn't work like that. You want to put those singers in the ranges which they work best in, and same for instruments. So in general, the oboe will sound sweeter in the upper ranges and the clarinet will sound sweeter in the slightly lower ranges. However, here I've decided to put the clarinets even higher than the oboes, and the reason for this is because clarinets, in those upper ranges, they like to scream, all right? In the higher ranges, the oboe will sound kind of restrained and quite sweet. Oh boy, the clarinet in those upper ranges, it wants to scream. So let's take advantage of that screaminess. Don't we want a very urgent kind of chord? Now, of course, this isn't exactly clarinet screaming range. This is actually like a normal note for the clarinet, but compared to the oboe playing that same notes, I hope you can tell that the oboe here sounds a little bit more mellow and darker than the clarinet here, which is much brighter at these notes. I didn't orchestrate the entire piece. It actually ends just a little bit after this, but anyway, because I want this big build up here, I have multiple instruments playing these notes here instead of just flutes. Like one oboe could play these two melody lines, but to make things easier on our oboe friends, I've put them in two different instrumentalists. So two different oboists will play these melodies. And then a big chord. Let's talk about this big chord here. In fact, I want you to hear this stuff first before I even talk about it. Let's start back from the first few piccolo and flute runs. So in this big dramatic finale, nothing says a drama like big high squeaky violins. What I've done here is I've used an instrument that hasn't really played any of the melodies so far. Like there was a little bit of melody happening in the strings over here with the spiccato, but that was spiccato. Here we have like nice long legato and tenuto parts. Because we haven't heard the violins really play a melody so far, it feels like this instrument almost comes out of left field to deliver just a finishing touch to this crescendo. If I had a larger orchestra, I might actually have reinforced these violin lines with other instruments, like maybe some more clarinets I would add. I chose not to include oboe for this. That was just a decision I made. I think I probably just heard the melody in the oboe and the violins and I didn't like it, so I got rid of it. Whereas the rest of the orchestra is playing this. And the way I want to convey this feeling of doom is, of course, having one big brass melody. All of the brass instruments playing the same darn thing. That sounds so imperial and imposing. Couple that with the bassoons, because I don't have a tuba in this orchestra, so I'm relying on the bassoons to give the low notes, and the clarinets are also there helping out. There ain't no dramatic moment in an orchestra without a wonderful bass drum roll. I think that having like a rolling bass drum, especially at forte, sounds kind of like an earthquake. It feels like the world is splitting in half, and I really like that kind of effect, so I use that here. Let's listen to that again. Now, we just return back to what we had in the beginning, with the spiccato strings playing the melody, and also this driving stuff happening down here. There's no col legno, but there's a lot of spiccato and staccato going on, so it's kind of similar. I've replaced the col legno kind of sound with this bass drum rim shot. So the bass drum player is playing on the rim of their instrument, which creates this like wooden kind of sound. I don't know, let's just listen to it. So similar to what was happening in col legno, but it's a different sound made by different instruments. Again, try not to repeat your orchestration too much, just to keep things interesting, not only for your players, but for your audience, and most importantly, for you. So we have the woodwinds exchanging melodies with the brass, which is a technique that we did before to increase interest, and lots more extreme dynamics, just to keep things moving forward, keep that forward momentum going. So we have piano to forte, piano, forte, piano, forte, piano. At the end of the piece here, I wanted like a slightly less loud and brash tone, especially after those nice violin lines. Most of the stuff is happening in the woodwinds here instead of the brass. Even the brass that are playing, they go from forte to piano, so they like die away. Not much to say here, just put your melodies in different instruments, try out combinations. Even though that this part is supposed to be like the quieter part after the storm, there's still a whole lot of dynamic range going on. If I remove these dynamics here, I think the piece would sound just so much more boring, like not much would feel like it's happening. Having these dynamics here, it's not a very big change, but It's a very big change in terms of how you hear it, not a big change in how you play it though. As an example, I removed the swell-in dynamic from piano to forte to piano from this last little section here just so you can hear the difference. First, without dynamic change. And now with dynamic change. Doesn't it just sound much more alive when you have those dynamics in place? So I suppose that'll conclude it for my comments on my arrangement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Movement 3. If you have any questions, just feel free to ask me. I don't really mind. I probably didn't cover everything. I didn't have a script for this video. I literally just pressed record and then see what would happen. I'll see y'all next time. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.